Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and hands-on learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. My name is Sylvan and I will be your host. Today we receive a visit from Silicon Valley. Philipp Stauffer, an investor from Palo Alto, returns to his home country and meets us for an interview in Zurich. Today we talk about his Swiss roots and how he made his way to the US despite the 9/11 terrorist attacks, how he became an investor and how he chooses his investments, the parallels between Elon Musk and the Swiss entrepreneur Alfred Escher, and much more. It is shortly after 10:30 a.m. on this Sunday morning and Philipp arrives at the Blue Line co-working space in Zurich. After an already very exciting preliminary talk, we start the microphones and explore Philipp's Swiss roots. Before we get started with the episode, I would like to introduce you to SBB Startup. If you think that your company is a good fit for the Swiss Railways, get in touch with them or learn more about their startup programs at sbbstartup.com. Philipp, a very warm welcome to the Swisspreneur Show. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're here in Zurich, pretty close to Winterthur, the city where you actually grew up. Nowadays you live in Silicon Valley in the United States, and you've basically traveled a lot through your different activities as a successful businessman, an entrepreneur, and also had some great investments in startups from all over the world. So I wonder, where does this entrepreneurial spirit come from? What influenced you to sort of take down this path and actually living at the edge of what's next, what's coming up in the future?
Yeah, interesting question. I think you always realize later in life why you do certain things. But I was always very excited about what's next. And I think that's what drove me in school. That's what drove me in jobs I took. My first job really was, one of the first jobs was with Vontobel Asset Management. And we launched back then, that was like around 1993, when we launched a Swiss small equity fund, which was an innovation back then to invest in small capped public companies. And I was lucky that I could travel around with sometimes with fund managers and interview management teams. And I got fascinated by by companies who maybe have 300 people. So it's kind of small, but they have 80% market share globally, right? And I constantly wondered, how is that possible for small companies to be so leading in certain areas? And I got more and more excited about, I was always excited about innovation, but I got more excited about learning why that is even possible. And I think that was kind of the time when I personally decided that I want to learn about that as an entrepreneur, as an employee somewhere, as whatever I do, right? So I looked for ways to do that. And as I voiced my ideas also with my boss back then at Vontobel, he started to realize, well, maybe Philipp is more interested in actually starting his company than being in fund management, which is interesting because I'm actually running a fund now. And I think he was right. So in life, sometimes you need to do certain paths that lead you to really what you want to do. So in order for you to be able to do it well. I also have and we probably talk about that a little later as well, but also I realized later, as my father actually was looking into our family history, that we were just full of crazy entrepreneurs. And part of my family, before the Second World War, built a significant cheese business in Hungary. My Bürgerort is Rüti bei Büren, Bern, but the Stauffer family was always in the cheese business. Very deep roots there, and part of the family went to Hungary to build the cheese business. And then after the Second World War, when the Russians came to Hungary and expropriated everything was gone. Factories, retail stores, it was a significant business. One of the factories actually was recently, a few years back, was sold for $800 million to a French company, but it was it was taken away and then owned by the government. And there's crazy stories there of my granduncles, 3 of them So think about it, right? Like the Russians came in, and then from one night to the other, all your property is gone, and now it's communism, right? And so what my uncles did is, the grand uncles did is, they looked at the key IP they had, which was one machine that did certain things around cheese manufacturing, very specific, novel ways. And so it's not a patent where you have like a piece of paper and you can replicate it, but you need the machine. And if you take now that machine and you take it out of the country, you go to jail, right? The previous day it was yours, now it's not. And so what they did is they disassembled the whole machine. The three brothers took parts of those parts of the machine, so nobody could really tell that you're stealing a machine. And one grand uncle went on a bike, the other one on a train, and the last one in other ways back to Switzerland. And then they assembled that machine again back in Switzerland after they got there. So in case the Russians would catch them, they couldn't tell. Switzerland then made it really hard actually for them to start a cheese business again. The Swiss cheese cartel was really strong, and they didn't like a new entrant coming back. And so they said, okay, well, then we go to the next cheese, let's say, cheese manufacturing area, which was Wisconsin in the US. So they left Switzerland and built another cheese business in Wisconsin. And it was interesting, there was an article at some point where they were celebrated in the US. The Swiss stole their own machine from the Russians, and they were, of course, celebrated as like representing capitalism. And anyway, there's a lot of these stories, but like in our family, and when I look back now, well, maybe there's a reason through those influences, like what I'm doing now, and that I'm just interested in not the old but the new.
So I think this is a really beautiful story that also shows that entrepreneurship is probably in your DNA.
Maybe.
Then you also worked at Accenture, that basically also, you traveled the world for your different clients, and then eventually also ended up in Silicon Valley with Accenture, where you also traveled before as a private person to take some holidays. What was the difference between traveling there as a private person for holiday and being there for business? I think that had a tremendous influence on actually why I then also moved there personally.
Right. Yeah. So as I was looking at, and it has a little bit like background also because I started my first company actually in Switzerland in 1993. And then through that ended up in frontier areas of technology development. That was at a time then later in 1997 where e-commerce would come up, like it was Yahoo went through the roof, Amazon, and everyone was saying, yeah, Amazon will completely fail because nobody will put their credit card number into a screen, right? And those things fascinated me because my first company that I started in Switzerland was all about physical consumer products and how to sell them in traditional ways into retail channels and so on, and helping inventors, international inventors, to place and market these products in the European market. So like all of that influence then really got me excited about that next wave of digital. What will happen with an Amazon, right? Will it remain a bookstore? I mean, Jeff Bezos always said this is not just a bookstore. This is just like the right way to start for certain reasons, to find a beachhead and then scale. But there was criticism, of course, all over the place of like, would that happen or not, right? And so I wanted to learn about that. And then a friend of mine at Accenture called me up and said, hey, why don't you join our e-commerce practice? We'll invest heavily in that space and you'll learn about it, right? And I was back then, through an acquisition, came into Interpublic. So I was at the typical incumbent large advertising conglomerate, a US one. And the whole advertising industry didn't really take digital serious. It was 98, 99, right? Google was just started in 99. And I remember a study I had to do for the executive team at Interpublic, how a bunch of us who had technology connections, what we think will happen to the advertising industry in the next 10 years. And our report and our recommendation was that we should start to learn like aggressively about like the Googles and the early and Yahoos and Amazon, because all of that will start to influence how consumers think about buying. We didn't really say, well, it will disrupt the whole advertising industry. It was in the early days, but we said it will influence consumers, and we as advertisers will have to understand how consumers will embrace it or not. And as an industry who is incumbent, has often and most often a very hard time to actually see the disruption that is coming, because they try to protect what they have. And it led to endless discussion. Eventually that call came from Accenture, and I'm like, maybe I should just speed up and like go where people already believe that this is happening. And I had an amazing time at Accenture. I went much deeper into technology. I'm not an engineer. Probably if I could pick again, I would probably do computer science today. You only get one shot in that decision. Maybe I do it later. I'm close to Stanford now. I can do it there or come back to ETH. That would actually be my choice. And so I learned a lot from very smart technologists, not just technology, but also the combination of technology and how can it then have an impact in consumers or businesses' life, right? And through that, I got exposed to Silicon Valley mainly through that B2B marketplace wave. Commerce One was a player, Ariba was a player. There was actually a prominent Swiss, Daniel Egerter, who built TradeX that was then acquired by Ariba. So I was right there, but I can't remember now. It was still in Switzerland, already there when that happened. But it was fascinating to me to hear that, in that frontier area, there's also a Swiss guy there who is already, I think it was out of Atlanta back then, who is an entrepreneur there, right? So I was influenced by stories like that. I was influenced by this community that believed that e-commerce will be a big new thing, digital. And when I came through these projects, 1 month, 2 months at a time to Silicon Valley, I saw Silicon Valley, to your question, a very different angle. Like when you come there as a tourist, you see Golden Gate, Coit Tower, beautiful landscape, but it feels like there's nothing going on the surface, right? It's like quiet. Even if you go to Palo Alto, right, or Stanford, it's all like people are walking around, and you go to a coffee shop, but what you realize is people are discussing ideas. And it's almost like if you start to double click on those discussions, and then you see there's a lot of depth and aggressiveness to pursue the visions that these people have. And when I came there as a professional in a project, right, you start to see the whole thing underneath. Mm-hmm. And I was like blown away on how people collaborate with each other, like how they help each other. Like there's, in any topic you can think of, you for sure find 20 experts in the area. And there's this amazing thing. You connect with somebody and you say, hey, I'm building something in this area, but you have some expertise. I'd love to have half an hour of your time. Can we have coffee? And it's almost guaranteed that next week you'll have coffee with them, right? Independent who it is. And that is an amazing sharing community, helping each other. You also have this critical mass of successful entrepreneurs and academia who want to help and mentor, right? And you can tap into their expertise, and it accelerates on how fast you kind of go with your own ideas, which is amazing. I would probably say in 2001, when I left, Switzerland was in a very different spot. Today, I'm really excited what's going on here. And so I felt I won my green card in the lottery.
How did that happen?
Well, like through those projects, I felt like, hey, I want to learn. Like I want to stay there. And I don't want to have an Accenture telling me you can or you cannot. Right? And so I'm like, how do I do that? Okay, you need the green card. And the diversity visa program that the US had back then, I think it just got stopped, unfortunately, by the current leader in the US. But so different countries had different contingents on getting visas, green cards. Switzerland had, of course, a smaller one than India, but still, I think the chances that you win in Switzerland were much higher because fewer people want to go in relation to that. And so I won the green card through that lottery. So I came home one night and from one of these trips from the US. I'm like, you know what, maybe that's a way to do it. And I just filled in the application. And then eventually got the letter that says, congratulations, you won the green card in the lottery. And then you have 6 months to go and you need to pack up and go pretty fast.
How did that feel when that letter arrived? Were you like super excited, or were you also like, okay, this is a new sort of unknown challenge for you too?
Well, first I was shocked because I got the letter and it looks very official, US and right. And I always remember when I went as a tourist, I not always paid my parking tickets.
Oh, so you were afraid that's biting back?
And not because I also didn't want to, but not because didn't want to pay for it, because like you're driving and you don't know how it works, and then you lose the ticket and then you forget it, and so I knew I missed some, right? And I thought that is a letter that now tells me here's your court date, and when you next time enter the US, I had all kinds of things before I opened this. Next time when you come to the US, you need to pay that amount of money or go to court right away or some things like that. And so I opened it, and then it was the opposite. So it was first a shock, and then like, oh my God, I won the green card in the lottery. Yeah.
And then there was also 9/11 happening within your 6-month time frame, and suddenly you had to decide pretty quickly whether you wanted to go to the US or not, right?
Right. Yeah, I remember I came back from Cologne, from Köln, from Germany, from a project. So I couldn't really listen to the news. So I came into Zurich, went to the office, and it was at the Accenture office in Zurich. And I came into this big room, meeting room. Everybody was sitting there. It was death quiet. And I saw the first tower come down. And I remember somebody was standing next to me like, that is a pretty crazy movie. Because I thought it was a movie, right? And he's like, no, that's real. I'm like, I mean, it was incredible. And then on the other side, Christian Baumgartner, who was leading Accenture back then in Switzerland, came over and told me, well, you better go as soon as you can, because I had an offer in the US, economy would go down, and now with the political uncertainty, his advice was to go as fast as possible before they pull the offer from the US office, right? And so that's what I did. I basically went home, packed my bags, and went with one of the first Swiss Air flights into the West Coast. I was on that flight. It was incredibly empty. It was the best flight I ever had. And it was, otherwise, like I might have lost my offer to go there, right? And then might have been too late and wouldn't have the green card. And sometimes you just need to make those decisions. All my friends and family thought I'm crazy. What, you're still going? I thought, by the way, now I definitely have to go.
Why?
Because that's what the terrorists want to do, right? They want to shock you and scare you, so you stop that we stop our plans. Mm-hmm. And I was like, no, now I definitely go, because that's not what anybody should do, right? And so for me, that's very clear. So, and I don't regret it either. It was clearly one of my best decisions. I met my new family there. I was able to go to grad school. I did everything I did so far, so I feel like very fortunate.
And then also at Accenture, you were basically always working at the next thing with growth teams, with strategy teams, or also with venture teams. So that sort of led the way back to the investment area. Can you tell us a bit more about the 130 investments that you did in different companies and startups through Accenture, and how that sort of also shaped your career as an investor later on?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was probably the Accenture technology. So Accenture had it was called Accenture Technology Ventures. It was a corporate venture arm, really. I didn't do personally 130 in investments.
Of course.
It was a portfolio by a global team of different partners in different regions. But for me, it was the first institutional approach to investing. I invested already a little bit before with friends and family. I invested as a founder, and maybe we talk about that after this question. Like, I actually feel like an investor, the biggest investor is always the founder. And I think that's sometimes really important to remember as a founder. That was the first institutional outside investor angle that I had. And we invested in mainly enterprise. We felt it is a great way to bring innovation to our clients. Accenture was also very successful with one investment, which is called Siebel CRM. Accenture had a big stake, was an early investor there, and all partners got a very big dividend when that company went public. And so that was kind of the trigger for Accenture to decide, hey, we need to institutionalize that. And we built, as a company, a portfolio of 130 companies. I was involved in 6 or 7 out of Europe, with, I think, 3 European companies and 4 in the US. And it was super interesting for me to be involved, not just on the deal side, but also on the operational side. I mean, not operational, but kind of advising side on how to operationalize, go to market, and in certain technology areas of those startups. That was the first institutional view on how to invest.
And then nowadays, you basically took that whole job on your plate with FYRFLY Venture Partners. You also invest in startups. What was then the motivation to actually, switch jobs, leave Accenture, and also do that on your own full time, basically?
Yeah, it's really like, I feel like investing in startups, particularly early stage, right? When you're very close to kind of the idea and you have maybe 2 founders, is very close to entrepreneurship. And we're an early stage fund, so we're usually investing as the first institutional investor in a founding team, right? And so it's not Series D when a lot of spreadsheets and financial models are very important, among all the other things. In our stage, it's really about the team. What are the stories of the founders? Why did they do this? Is it just to hop on a trend, or is it because they have a deeper mission on what they want to do? And we have a little bit a unique angle to look at mission-driven entrepreneurs, because we care about mission and impact. So it has to be something that leaves the world in a better place than before the entrepreneur did the company. But then also it's a little bit self-serving to find real entrepreneurs. Because if you find a mission-driven entrepreneur versus just somebody who hops on a trend, that person will less likely give up. And you see, what will we see this year? We'll see Airbnb in an IPO, and many people who are not close to this, they just see the IPO and the $1 billion exits, and they're like, wow, I need to do that too. Well, it's not a path from here to here. It's not linear. It is a crazy roller coaster. And if you dig a little deeper in the Airbnb, it was a crazy roller coaster. And you need to be ready for that. If you're just an entrepreneur who has an idea and hops on a trend, you won't survive when the roller coaster goes down, because you're like, okay, that's too hard, I go back to my job, right? If you have a mission and you try to solve a big problem and you're on the roller coaster, you will fight whatever is needed to get back up. And even if you don't, and your cart on the roller coaster flies off and you crash with your company, you start the next one. And you don't give up your mission. You're so committed to what you feel has to be solved that you will just do the next. And even now, if we fund a founder who then crashes the company, it doesn't mean that we won't fund him or her in her next startup. As long as ethics and transparency and everything is there, right? The likelihood for you to crash your company is very high.
Absolutely. Right. In that regard, also the sort of the definition of failure gets a whole new level, right? Because what you just described is like failing doesn't really mean that your company fails, but it's more tied to the mission. Can you also a bit more elaborate on that topic?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I love that question because, and it has a lot to do with Switzerland, right? How we see failure. And that's something you hear in almost every interview from people like, we should accept failure. Well, for me personally, it's really about you're never really failed and are done with failing before you give up your mission, right? So it doesn't mean that you failed because you missed to make a company successful, but I think you failed and you internally will know when you failed because your head told you, now I don't go after my mission anymore. And I think those are the moments where you personally are disappointed about yourself because you couldn't find any other way to kind of go after your mission. Right. Then you failed. So I think in life, like look at that moment and try to avoid that failure, right? The failure of running a company into the ground, sometimes it's needed to keep going on your path. And as long as you keep your mission going that you really care about, then you're just failing. And then hopefully at some point you're succeeding, right? Exactly. And so it's might be a little bit philosophical, but that's really how I think about it.
I think that's a beautiful definition or way to look at it. Are there some good examples of a mission that people follow that you admire, for example? I think you wrote a very great article about Elon Musk, for example, and compared him to Alfred Escher. Maybe you also see some mission that drives Elon Musk, for example, is a good example here.
Yeah, I mean, that article I wrote because as a public market investor, there's growth investors and then there's value investors, right? And okay, Tesla from a valuation perspective is always kind of at the extreme outlier of growth investing. So value investing, clearly I have no argument, no rationale to even touch Tesla, right? As a growth investor, you have to get very stretched if you just look at metrics, right? And so I always had a hard time to explain that. And it's funny, like my dad visited me in Silicon Valley and he asked, what are you doing, right? Like, and I always had this like it was hard. It's sometimes hard to understand to your parents what consulting is because you always do different things, right? And then I leave and start a company that is hard to explain, and then I'm investing. So he asked that, and I explained it to him. Well, we look for talented people who are mission driven, and then we help them with what we learned and with money from our investors to help them succeed if we believe in what they're doing. He's like, oh, you're trying to find the next Alfred Escher. And I hardly remembered from history in school who he was. And then he sent me the biography. There's a beautiful like German actually version, an English version from NZZ. And I'm like, oh my God, he's like the Elon Musk 200 years ago. And then I'm like, that's exactly it. It's like an Elon Musk, you can't compare a Tesla to Toyota and Volkswagen. It's not a car company. It's like he cares about like solving the energy value chain and how people get from A to B. And he's on a value chain level, not on a company level. And Alfred Escher was exactly the same. He wanted to build a strategic asset in Switzerland that made sure that if back then the Germans would attack, that the French would help us or the Italians would help us, and in any other combination, right? And so he said we need a tunnel, because if we have a tunnel and the French would attack us, the Germans would care and they would help us. And if the Italian would do it, like the others would help us, right? Exactly. And politically, that was his idea, really. And then he realized Switzerland was a very poor country. The people would leave to the US because we didn't have food here. We don't really have anything, right? We don't have resources, nothing. We only have Alps and water. And so he realized that there's no commercial banks. There were only private banks in Switzerland. And so he's like, I can't take the money from the people I try to protect Switzerland from. So I need to start a commercial bank. And so he started SKA, which became Credit Suisse. So he was thinking on solving a higher level problem than just a company. So very mission driven, right? And then it goes on, right? I mean, then he didn't really have the engineering talent he needed, and he realized Switzerland needs to be leading around engineering and sciences, and so he started ETH, and then he founded ETH, and then he realized that insurance is a market or a problem we have to solve because of the people who go and build these tunnels. So he started Swiss Life, and then insurance companies overextend themselves, so they need an insurance too. So he started Swiss Re. So it's like, if you look at it and just look, that guy is completely unfocused, right? And Elon too. People criticize him for saying, hey, well, what are you doing? Like you're doing SpaceX, Tesla, digging tunnels, interestingly, also digging tunnels, like Alfred Escher. But it's all a perspective on how you define focus and what problem do you try to solve. Mm-hmm. And I think as an entrepreneur and as an investor, you need to be sometimes a little bit more creative on how you define that. And it's clearly, in my opinion, it's clearly the wrong approach to say Tesla is a car company. That's not the problem he tries to solve, right? It's just part of the solution. And that's why I believe in that article, right? I said Tesla will be 10x in 10 years, because it sounds easy or simple. I think it will actually be worth more, because the problems he solves are massive, and he doesn't give up, right? Because I think I say 10% probability of being zero, because he always pushes Tesla and anything he does to the edge. So there's very little wiggling way to, like, if something goes wrong. But that's what you got to do. If the life is short.
Absolutely. Are there also other examples from startups that you invested in for like good missions that they follow and that inspire them and drive them?
When we look at entrepreneurs and maybe on the mission side of our fund. So when I came to Silicon Valley, there was one crazy guy who started to talk about software as a service, and that was Mark Benioff, who started Salesforce. And it was a small company. He came out of Oracle. Oracle is an important Accenture partner. We were thinking about, as a strategy team, the future of enterprise software. It was around 2000, between 2002 and 2004. And we saw this software as a service move coming. And I was lucky to just be able to go and chat with Mark Benioff and Suzanne DiBianca and the early team members, Tien Suo, who then started Suora, which is now also a public company, and just understand what they were trying to do and where they see the future. And to me, their explanation of software as a service, on-demand computing, cloud, it just made sense. It had a lot of hurdles because software was not bought that way. CTOs were very concerned to have data outside their firewall, but these people saw around the corner. They were contrarians, but right? Reid Hoffman said that very beautifully. As an entrepreneur, you have to be contrarian. You have to believe in something that 99% of the people don't believe in, but eventually you have to be right? If you invest in things that everybody already knows, then you're basically like investing in a commodity. So it's okay if a lot of people tell you you're wrong, this will never work and whatever. And Mark was one of the icebreakers that created this opening in a big pack of ice to build opportunity for a new world of software, right? Maybe that's the wrong comparison, because a lot of ice breaking is happening because of climate change. But he clearly opened up that path for other entrepreneurs to build a big ecosystem, right, in that space. But where I wanted to go around mission driven is Mark also, at that point, I was doing my MBA as well, and I learned in school like shareholder principle and stakeholder principle. And so when he told me the first time about his beliefs on compassionate capitalism, which is like, okay, as a company, you have to give back to community. And I tried to understand, okay, so you're really a stakeholder guy. And I remember he told me, no, I'm just a smart shareholder guy. Which is it's an interesting statement of like, no, it is about driving profits, but if you do it in a smart way and you take care of your environment, you'll be more successful in long term. And today, Salesforce is a company that always gets the highest scores of employee satisfaction. It's one of the most successful software service companies. It's an amazing culture in the company, and there's a lot of data where Suzanne DiBianca, who ran that program for many years since the beginning with Mark, can prove that it actually works. So the program 111, I don't know if you heard about that before, but 1% of equity, 1% of time, 1% of product goes back to the community, might sound like little. But the point of that is, if you build that into the DNA of a company from the very beginning, you just build a very different company. You build a company that thinks a little farther than just creating a product and shipping it. The people who join your company, they think harder about joining because they will ask, the good people always ask, what's your mission? Where do you want to go? And if there's more than just a company and selling product, what I realized through my life is you attract better, more resilient people, people who care more about more than just themselves. They're better team players. And so it has a lot of benefits to think that way. And it influenced me since the beginning when I met him in 2001, what that could mean. And when I started my startup back in 2012, actually the core mission was around that, doing well and doing good together. And so through my life, I started to really think about that. And I was influenced very early, then I realized also as an 80-year-old, and I think we talk about that a little later. I realized that mission-driven is something important to find the true goal of an entrepreneur, of what you do, right? When I then found my partner at FYRFLY, Julie Maples, she also did a lot of philanthropic giving back activities in her life. She started one of the biggest wine auctions in the US to give back for independent, crazy scientists who have different approaches on how to kill cancer, which is also kind of seed funding. And she has done an amazing job over the last 20 years. She lost her mom very early to cancer, and for her that was a very important thing to think harder about. And she spent a lot of time and effort to build up that team and that effort. And so when we got together with FYRFLY, we said, hey, we somehow need to do something to keep us going on that path of giving back and finding entrepreneurs who have a deeper mission, right? Because in Silicon Valley, sometimes if you particularly earlier, now like everybody seems to be jumping on that thing, but let's say 5 years ago, it was like, well, no, you drive profits first and then you can go after your hobby of making the world better, right? Silicon Valley sometimes is a little bit too much in love with itself, thinking any piece of technology that is developed will do good. And as we know, we're going into a very different phase in the next 10, 15 years around data ethics, AI. We have to go a little deeper, right? It's not just about technology anymore. And so that was important to us. So we looked for concepts. How could we do this and implement it with our fund when we started it back in 2015? Julie and I, by the way, we did investing, both of us, for a long time before. And she did it much earlier already in Silicon Valley when I was not even there yet. I was just watching from Europe. And we felt like we just want to have that component in our fund too. And we debated and brainstormed, and then we're like, wait, what about 111 from Mark Benioff? And I contacted Suzanne DiBianca and said, is it okay if we steal that concept from Salesforce? And she's like, she's laughing, and she's like, yeah, of course. And I'm super proud that you guys want to bring this to venture capital. We were the first firm, probably. Actually, there was another one in Australia associated with Atlassian who did it as well, but we were the first firm to really take that concept and not just using it for ourselves as the firm, but also allowing entrepreneurs to think about it and implement those ideas. A lot of entrepreneurs we interview and they pitch to us, and they're trying to get to this, like, what is your mission really? Right? And then they're like, well, maybe I shouldn't tell you because you're an investor, right? Until we actually disclose, we're actually okay with that. If you have an idea and you think your technology can do more than just sell it, but it can have an impact. Warby Parker is an idea, right? Like you buy a pair of glasses and somebody in need gets one. Those ideas are not necessarily just reducing your profits. They build a brand and you might be selling more and have an impact, right? And that thought fascinated us of like, impact is not, today's impact world, like today I think that the stats are 90% of investments, of overall investments go into traditional investing, and 10% today are impact investments. And we feel, Julie and I, we feel like that's complete nonsense. It should just be thoughtful, impactful investments. It shouldn't be, if you say 10% are impact investments, and you're basically saying 90%, what are they? They don't care. They just care about profits.
Right.
I mean, it's an interesting debate, and we decided that we want to help entrepreneurs to proactively go after those because it might be a way to motivate them as well to think even harder and work harder and make their companies work. And in some cases, we have quite a few stories where that actually starts to work and is working. And we also feel like we win deals because we disclose that and have that proactive discussions, because other investors are saying, no, don't do that. That's not a focus.
And this relationship between, the mission-driven or the impact that you have of your business and the more positive return is also something that you experienced early on as an 8-year-old when you were selling greeting cards, right?
Yeah.
Can you probably tell us this story? Because I think this is a very good illustration of what you just described.
Right. Actually, my parents really had to lift me to not being greedy. So I mean, every kid that is born in Switzerland, I think, is just incredibly lucky. Right? We get born here, we go to school, we don't really know what other kids don't have. And when I was 7 or 8, I wanted to have a new bike because my brother got one. He was a little older, and my parents said, "No, you got to wait." And I'm like, "Okay, then I'm buying it by myself." And so my parents were teaching me. My dad was a really good artist, and we were always drawing a lot of things. And so my brother and I and my sister were always good in art. And so I said, okay, well, this is my talent, and I'm drawing cards, greeting cards. I'll go to the market and sell them, and I will use the money to buy my bike, right? So I said that's my plan, and my parents were like, yeah, why don't you go to the local market and sell those? So I was drawing dozens of cards, went to the market, and was there the whole day on Saturday. And it was very boring, and I sold 2 cards, and I had 2 francs, I think, afterwards. 2 or 4 francs.
Still a long way to go for a bike.
Very long way to go. And I came back home, and my dad and my mom asked, so how did it go? And they were, of course, checking on me like the whole day. And I was very frustrated, and I'm like, well, I have to go I have to go back many times to get that done. And then my parents took like an ad from Terre des Hommes, which is a non-profit that helps kids in Africa, and showed me the first time where I saw a shocking picture of a kid that really didn't eat for a long time. And that's a different time, right? This is the time when the parents can take away the newspaper, and you don't know what's going on in the world. That doesn't happen today. Today the kids
no internet, no smartphone.
That's right. So that was the first time, and I was shocked, right? And I'm like, why? I'm already having a bad day, not selling anything on my market. Why is why are my parents showing me this? And then my parents told me, well, this is a kid who has other problems than buying a bike. And you have a bike, it's just not a new one. Right. And it might be a little too small now, but that kid has different problems. And then I'm like, okay, why does that matter? and so my parents said, look, maybe you should forget your bike. The idea with your cards is a great one, but why don't you make that money and then you give it to Terre des Hommes and help those kids? And I'm like, I can do that? And they're like, well, you could make that money and then maybe you sell more. And when you send that money to that organization, they will go to Africa and get that money directly to those kids, and they might get a breakfast, right? Mm-hmm. And because as a kid, you don't even understand how somebody here in Switzerland can help in Africa, right? And so for me, it is like, I'm not sure if I slept, but I clearly remember it as a day that had a lot of impact on me. And so the next day I said, okay, and I'm like, what about my bike? He's like, well, why don't you try this? And then you can always go back to your bike, right? Mm-hmm. Well, okay. So I go the next day and I have Terre des Hommes and I say every cent of what you buy goes to Terre des Hommes, and the whole thing is sold out, right? And I made $200, 200 Swiss francs that day, and I'm like, wow, that's half the bike, or even the whole bike back then. I can't remember now. But yes, this is a promise. I will send that money to Terre des Hommes. And at that point, I also felt like, wow, these people all care about that too. Maybe I'm just a jerk and I don't care, I really care about. So it was like a very fast learning curve. I'm like, okay, this is not all about yourself, right? And so, but it also had this impact of like the success story of then selling all of this, and these people who asked me all these questions about Terre des Hommes that I couldn't really answer because I just learned about it the previous night. Is like, I need to learn about this. And so we sent this first payment to Terre des Hommes, and they realized I'm like 7 or 8 years old, and they sent me all these materials that I could also put on the booth. And I went back and back and back, and I went many times. And eventually a journalist like heard about it in the Lampot. The Lampot is still around.
Still exists in Winterthur, yeah, absolutely.
Tagesanzeiger now, right? Belongs to Tagesanzeiger.
Yeah.
And then he came on a Saturday when I was there and started to take pictures and interviewed me, and then I ended up on the front page as the youngest entrepreneur in Winterthur, helping kids in Africa. And I got all this credit. It was not really my idea, but I feel like it was really my parents' idea, but it was something that I actually never really, I did that then for a year or two. Mm-hmm. And later, I didn't really make the connection of what I just told you about Mark Benioff and 111, but sometimes you don't connect these things, why you do these things, but I think when I look back now, all of these things have a clear connection, right? On mission driven. And I realized when I look now, I realized that even people who don't think about it, giving back. Mm-hmm. Because I look at it through a different lens, and my partner as well, Julie, we might see a piece of technology that could have such a huge impact in another place that we might suggest it, right. and see how the entrepreneur reacts. We don't force it on our entrepreneurs. We also invest in companies that don't have that. Mm-hmm. We just felt like it's an amazing filter for really finding people who care more than just the company. And those are usually the ones who care about a mission, who then don't give up, right? Yeah. So it's kind of, it's an interesting path. And then on mega trends, I mean, if you look at how younger kids, even my kids, how they're informed, how much they know about what's going on in the world, and how many questions I get that are hard to answer sometimes to a child who is like 7 years old because they saw it on a news feed, is incredible. And those kids are all influenced with what's going on in the world much earlier, and therefore they become active on trying to change it much earlier. And therefore I'm very positive for the world, because our generations are kind of sitting here not doing much, but you see this move coming. Certain things have to change very quickly, right? And I constantly run into these people, and it's super motivating.
What would you recommend to young people just finishing school or university about how to go and find and learn more about the mission that really drives them? Is there any good recommendation from your end?
I just think follow your passion. You can't go and learn being mission driven. I think you learn being mission driven around following your passion, because when you follow your passion, always think life is short, and always take any opportunity to follow your passion. And don't think about like, oh, maybe that job pays better, and therefore I go and divert away from what my passion, my heart really tells me. Because as soon as you do that, you're wasting your time, right? You might make more money, but that's at the end just money. It's like, it's your life and finding your passion that really allows you to see what your mission is, mm-hmm. right? The worst is if you're like 99 and you're like, you have a few more breaths, and you have to feel like you just discovered 2 weeks ago what you should have done in your life because you followed the wrong signals, or you followed a herd mentality of what people think is right to do. That's a waste of your life, right? And so I felt, when I look back, sometimes I did that too, but I always kind of, eventually I had an awakening thing that said, okay, I'm on the wrong path. That's not what I want to do.
Can you give us an example for such a situation?
So Accenture is one of them, right? With Accenture, it is an amazing company where you kind of get hired and then you're in an open marketplace of hundreds of opportunities. You have to follow your passion there, because if you don't, you just get pushed into like the projects that you don't really like. When I started at Accenture, I got the advice often that, hey, if you want to make partner, you have to focus more on the bigger projects, because there you can show that you can generate revenue and you'll be more successful faster and you become partner faster. For me, that was always like, I was always at the smaller, edgy things. Those start small, right? Yeah. The Mark Benioff Salesforce thing was very hard to build up, that partnership. Now today, it's the biggest partnership between a services company and a software company with, I think, more than $2 billion on each side. But it took years to get there, right? And I was lucky that I just arrived in Silicon Valley. Nobody really wanted to take care of that company because it would also disrupt Accenture's implementation model, right, with software as a service. But for me, it was fascinating. So I followed that passion and spent time with all of that early stuff, because I felt like that's the next thing. I could have gone and done large scale implementations, which would have I would have become partner faster at Accenture. I became partner in 2007, which is still not bad after 9 years. But I probably could have been faster, but would I have learned the same things? Would I have been exposed to the same opportunities that are so important for me now personally? No, I have never, right? Accenture to me is like family, and I found mentors within Accenture who helped me stay true to like what I want to do, right? And that's like, it's just super important, because if you stay on your path that you feel is the right path, even though it's not the money or wherever everybody else goes, you much more convincing to others. You're much more convincing, you're much more passionate, you have more to say, you don't get tired. Life is not, when you follow your passion, life feels like not work, but just fun. I don't feel I'm working very hard and very long, and it doesn't feel like work.
That's a beautiful feeling, right?
It's a beautiful feeling, but you only do that if you follow your passion. And sometimes it's hard to know if you're still on your path. So I did larger engagements as well, but I was not happy. And I'm like, this is boring to me. Like doing too many things too many times for too long gets boring to me, right? And that's not my strength. And so it's important, it's super important in certain jobs, but that would be the wrong thing for me, because I wouldn't be good. Or I could force myself in there and get really unhappy, right? And so I've always followed and that's why investing for me is also so exciting, particularly early stage, because you work with multiple entrepreneurs, you have to deal with multiple problems. You can help this entrepreneur because you just learned something from this entrepreneur. And we all learn from each other, right? Building an early stage venture firm, we're still entrepreneurs too. Like we started in 2015. Yes, we invested over the last 15 years, but we started a firm and it's building up a firm. We're like doing the same thing. We're raising funds. We're having our customers. We see our founders. We serve them, right? We're not invest in them and then they report back to us. And we're part of their team. And so we're building kind of a startup on top of startups, right? And if a founder becomes successful, we need that success story for us to be successful. Otherwise, we lose, right? It's like we don't make our own story really. We make the story, the combined story of the startups we support and the founders we support. And so I think that's not every investor sees it that way, but Julie and I, we both have entrepreneurial backgrounds. And so we always feel in the shoes of the entrepreneur, much more than the investor. And that helps in times when things don't go well. And there's always a moment.
That's part of entrepreneurship.
Many moments where things don't go well, and you need the right partners then who were in those shoes as well, and don't freak out and stress out and make the wrong decisions or push you into wrong decisions.
In that regard, earlier you also mentioned that the investment of the entrepreneur is actually the most important one. Can you also tell us a bit more about what that actually means? That the time of the founders or the entrepreneurs is actually probably even more important than the money coming from the investor.
Yes. So the entrepreneur, like sometimes it's this weird relationship, and particularly Swiss entrepreneurs, actually US too. Like a lot of entrepreneurs come and ask us, how should we tell our story that investors will like it? And I always almost get mad. I'm like, that's the wrong thing to think about this. The biggest investor in what you do is yourself. Money is secondary because you only have that much time in your life, and you just dedicated a big chunk of your time that you have to your startup. So you invest your time, so you have opportunity cost. You probably invested some money. You probably invested relationship because you asked your friend and your dad and maybe your girlfriend or your wife to invest as well. For sure, you might not even have asked your partner, your wife, husband, fiance. You might, because they're just with you, but they're investing because they have to deal with you when you're at a low point and you're in a bad mood. They have to deal with the anxiety that, okay, you're making less money and it's very, very uncertain if you're successful. They deal with you waking up at 3 a.m. at night because you're having to fix a code that just because the system crashed with a customer. They are your partner, right? So you're investing your life, your time, your relationships. You put all of that into one basket. Now, the investor who gives you a check, that's like a minor thing, right? if you think about it that way. So I always feel like investors are a little bit overrated, that they're very helpful, and many investors are majorly responsible for some of the successes, but because they're good partners and they understand this, not because they gave them the money, right? The money is needed to scale. Of course, you need capital, right? But it's about the moments when things don't go how they go. It's the moments when, let's say, a founder gets into serious problems in a relationship because there's too much tension. Sometimes I have discussions with a partner of a founder when it really goes bad, so that the stories that she or he hears at home are not. There's another version to it, right? And we as investors can then sometimes help to tell the story. Yeah, you're in a tunnel, but there's light at the end of the tunnel, and this is a very bad time, but don't put everything don't crash everything because of this phase of the tunnel. And so it's you do a lot of, as investors, you do a lot of other work to help the entrepreneurs to get through that sometime. But my tip for an entrepreneur is really think about yourself as the biggest investor, and think about your mission, stay true to your passion, and you should think of it as an honor for somebody else to invest in your company. It's not you have to go back and it's overrated. I feel like the investment part is, I feel, a little bit overrated.
I think this is a very beautiful statement to end this episode. Before we conclude, we have 2 last questions for you. The first one is, are there any favorite gadgets or tools that you use yourself on a regular basis that you can recommend?
Gadgets or tools?
Your phone, a specific yoga mat, anything that comes to mind. Sure.
I love my Tesla 3.
I think that's a very good one.
It has almost everything in it. A big screen, a phone. Phone is not there, but I definitely make my calls from there.
Awesome. And are there any additional resources like blogs, books, podcasts, whatsoever, that you yourself consume on a regular basis?
Yes, I'm reading a lot. So I think reading is one of the things that really just excite me, because they open more questions than answers. They're really good books, and so I love to explore and get as many different opinions about a topic than I can. That's why I also love to. I'm a bad writer, but
that's not true.
Well, I have help there. I have ideas, but then I have help on how to write it. But I love to write not because of just stating a point of view, but because of like putting an opinion out there is controversial. Because I get a lot of feedback from people who agree and people who disagree. And the people who disagree is super interesting for me to dive into and say, so why do you disagree? What do you think the future will look like? And so without reading, you don't get to new ideas on how the world is going. And so there's many books, and I think every month I probably at least read 7 to 10 books on different topics. So I should probably publish a book list as well if somebody's interested.
That would be a good suggestion for a next blog article.
Few people do that, and sometimes I pick up actually the books that other people are reading too on their lists. I should probably do that.
So we stay tuned for another cool blog article of yours in that regard then.
One of my favorite books, by the way, is, and it remained as one of my favorite, is Life 3.0. It's a book about AI. So I don't want to talk about it too much because there's a lot of interesting emotions that will come up if you decide to read it. But it's a book about how Life 3.0 could look like. And it's a beautiful book that opens more questions than gives you answers. It always goes back to, so what do you think? And that's a very interesting, if you're interested in artificial intelligence and how robotics and all those coming technologies will impact us, it's a beautiful book to read to start thinking and make up your mind what you would do. So that's one of my favorite, but then...
Sounds like an interesting trip to take.
The next one.
Awesome. Philip, that was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for your valuable stories and insights. And we're already looking forward to the next episode with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the content, we would be thrilled to receive your rating on Apple Podcasts. That way you not only support Swisspreneur, but also help other entrepreneurs discovering the show and finding more valuable information on how to run their businesses. Next week, we will already be back with an all new episode of the Swisspreneur Show, so we hope to see you again then for a new episode. In the next episode of Swisspreneur, you will learn from Philipp Stauffer how you can grow your company internationally, why Silicon Valley is not always the right choice for your startup, and also whether he prefers Apple or Google. Make sure to tune in to an all new episode of the Swisspreneur Show next week.